Welcome to ICA. ICA is an integrated global network of middle market advisory and finance firms. Clients of ICA member firms benefit from the personalized senior partner attention of the local firm that has been engaged, amplified by the expertise, relationships and resources of our global investment banker and advisor network. ICA was formed in 2009 and has grown year on year to the professional organisation it is today. ICA members have experience in mergers, acquisitions, capital raises and joint venture transactions for a wide range of industries, including technology, healthcare, consumer products, industrials, financial services, distribution, transportation and energy. ICA member firms close between 200 and 250 deals each year, with a total enterprise value between $5 and $7 billion. ICA is active across the Americas, Europe and Asia in developed economies, as well as high-growth markets such as China, India, Brazil and Eastern Europe. ICA member firms total 41 at present, which represents over 250 professionals. These professionals meet face-to-face each year at the ICA Global Conferences, which rotate between Asia, the Americas, Europe and the Middle East. For more information, visit icanetwork.com or get in touch with any of our member firms. We look forward to working with you.
Hi everyone, my name is John Carvello and I am the president of Stone Oak Capital and Divestopedia. I'm so excited for this discussion today. As always, I have some wonderful guests to share their M&A deal stories. These incredible professionals are going to illustrate how to create value before going to market, before receiving an LOI, and then after receiving an LOI. So they're going to give us a lot of their experience, a lot of their stories, again, just on how they've been able to do that. So joining me today are Lindley Edwards, CEO at AFG Venture Group, joining us from Sydney, Australia. Hi, Lindley.
Hi, everyone.
Simon Davies, partner at FRP Corporate Finance, joining us from Reading, England. Hey, Simon.
Hi, everyone. Hi there.
And then Michael Carter, managing partner at Carter Morse Goodrich, joining us from Connecticut, US. Hey, Michael.
Good to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, so just for a little bit of housekeeping for everybody that's on, we have an amazing number of people that are joining us from around the world today. So we have the Q&A box open. We'll be taking questions in the last 10 minutes of this panel discussion. And then we also have the chat box open today for everybody. So if you want to make any comments throughout the webinar or the panel discussion, please do so. It'd be fun to have everybody provide some comments. Also, I'd want to thank our sponsor for the panel discussion today, the Alliance of International Corporate Advisors. All of our panelists are actually members at the AICA. And Simon, you're actually the chairman of the Alliance for this year. Could you quickly tell us a little bit more about the Alliance for our audience?
Yes, thanks, John. The Alliance is made up of 41 firms across 39 countries. We're covering 6 continents and have more than 250 professionals, professional investment bankers within those firms across the globe. And they're all boutique advisory firms. And what we mean by that is that they're generally partner-led, so you get the real expertise. And it was set up to ensure that the mid-market, the lower mid-market between $5 million and $150 million in deal size, we could provide those services of investment bankers across the globe in a consistent and unified way to ensure that those firms have the appropriate resources. And that's ICA. It's on www.icanetwork.com if you want to find out more.
Yeah, and you've actually done deals with Lindley and Michael, so we've discussed this a lot. But the network is really tight, and there's definitely lots of synergies by having that global exposures in there.
Yeah, and we know each other personally. We meet up every 6 months across the network, and that is really key to be providing proper resource to our clients, because it's based on trust and experience of working with each other, and that's really important.
Yeah, incredible. Well, hey, everybody, why don't you guys let our panelists know where you're from? And just, I see some people entering comments in the chat box, but it's always nice to get a sense for where people are from in the, around the world that are joining us today. Awesome. Yeah, great. Pakistan, Dallas, this is incredible. Montreal, Tampa, this is awesome. Okay, guys, this is exciting, and I am so looking forward to this. I do have to thank Michael Carter. He's the guy that came up with this idea of sharing deal stories, and just giving their experiences on how they've executed on transactions and really tried to maximize value through sharing some anecdotes and some stories. So let's really get into this. So our first set of deal stories that we're going to talk about are around stories that are pre-market phase. So this would be that 1 year before going to market or before even engaging an investment banker. So deciding when and how to sell, it's that phase that we're going to be talking about. And Lindley, maybe we'll let you share your story around how you've been able to kind of create value for clients in this phase of kind of the M&A process or the M&A transaction.
Okay, thank you, John. And yes, the pre-market phase is a very important preparation phase. And what I would use as an example is a client of ours who came with a messaging service and an associated device and services business. And what that did is that really didn't gel a lot with the market, because people in the market tend to separate out hardware and separate out services and software. So what we did is when we looked and delved into the business further, we saw that they could probably have a more impactful narrative. And what we did is we positioned the business as an Internet of Things business. And what that was focused on an enabling platform that emphasized the role of the messaging services and the devices actually needed to be in place. So the messaging and the data capture all came off of this single architecture. And this was very, very important, because out of that we got valuable insights. And so people were able, who wouldn't normally buy a hardware and software business, more looking at services, became very interested. So my key takeaway is to say that if you've got to craft a value focused narrative for your business that highlights its strategic significance to potential acquirers, because that's very critical to achieve the best value. And it's aligning your capability, your message, all of the materials that you give to potential purchasers with the market opportunity, and make it very dynamic.
So Lindley, in that instance, like how far before you went to market did you craft this strategy with your client?
It was actually 2 months before they went to market.
Okay.
And it actually helped the business to do this combined narrative, because they'd really said, here's 2 business units and they never spoke with each other. So it created a better alignment in the business as we went to market.
Yeah, and there's spinning the story, but then there's also like, it has to be real within the business. So how did that company actually create kind of the realness around, this story that you were spinning for them?
Well, it really was true, but they hadn't pulled the narrative together internally, and they hadn't communicated that as well as what they could have to clients. But it became a very compelling narrative for the buyer, who realized that you needed the architecture to put the messaging services and capture data, and also create this Internet of Things information flow.
Yeah, and I guess it has to be real, like you were saying, right? Like it was the actual reality of the business. It was just positioning it in a different way that a buyer could more easily identify the real value that was created.
Yeah, and the good news was that we got more for the business than what they expected. That was always that's a good sort of footnote to the story.
100%. Yeah, that is true value creation, as I say, right? Where you can quantify, exactly what it would have been otherwise. So that's incredible. Yeah, great. Thank you for sharing that story. I also have to thank you for waking up so early. It's early where you're at, so I appreciate you taking the time and joining us.
if I'm not really my brightest, it's like 4 o'clock in the morning isn't really my optimal time, but I'll do the best I can.
No, that was an incredible story. So we appreciate sharing. Simon, how about you? If you could share with us your story around, again, this pre-marketing phase before you even hire an investment banker, what you've done for, some of your clients around creating value or positioning or strategy.
Yeah, it's all about preparation. I think it's looking forward to timing. We worked with one client who wanted to sell and walk away from his business. Now, if they just came through the door and said, right, I want to go and sell my business next week, it's very difficult to get the right value if the founder is going to walk away and leave the business. But we met this client in advance. We talked to him, we listened to him and understood his objectives. And actually, we had worked with someone previously in the same industry, and we were able to introduce them into the business. And this was a bit further out. This was a couple of years before we went to market. But having been introduced into the business and was working there, he then stepped up to the CEO role about 12 months before we went to market. And that meant that when we went, there was already a succession plan in place and a full team in place. Now, we've done that, and it's a bit longer ahead. We've also done it before in another business where we actually did a full review for them, kind of overall assessment of the fitness of the business to enter a sales process. And whilst there were a few of the shareholder directors who were looking to step away, this was a bit more near term. It was only 6 months before going to market, but we were able to advise them on appointing a couple of the wider management team to the board to obviously, if 3 out of 4 are leaving, it doesn't sound so good, but if 3 out of 7 are leaving, it's something that you can position and work with a bit more. But it wasn't just around management. We went through the whole business looking at the preparation and readiness for sale, and were able to give them a report, which we then fed in when we were appointed for the sale. We were able to have a timeline and process to prepare those aspects of the business ready to launch to market.
How do you convince a shareholder that, hey, like, we need to find a replacement for you, or a CEO or some executive person, to say to make it more valuable, more saleable? How do you convince the CEOs? I know are sometimes a little strong-headed, and maybe that might be a tough conversation to have.
To be honest, sometimes they vote for it themselves. For them, it's a great idea because it means they don't want to. A business they've established and grown, sometimes over 30 years, 40 years, they really don't believe they can work for anyone else. And therefore, they're quite receptive to the idea of allowing that. Now, it's easier in some cases in smaller businesses, but we recently did that on a transaction that we sold for 115 million pounds sterling. We were able to bring in a replacement CEO at the time of doing the deal, so not ahead. But I guess in that case, the buyer was confident that there was enough resource around the business to enable that to happen at the time of the transaction.
Mm-hmm. And what did you find that did to the actual transaction? I mean, did that shorten the time frame of the transition period required for that CEO? Did that maybe change the terms where less seller financing or less of an earnout was required? What were the consequences of you doing that, and how did that kind of create value?
Yeah, in the first instance, with introducing them a year ahead, they were able to. It did improve the seller position. I think he would have had to stay possibly for 12 months within the operational side of the business rather than stepping up to non-exec. That was an option, but he really didn't feel that he could work with someone post-sale. And it also meant that he did roll over something into the business, but it was a much smaller amount. It was only, I think, 15-20% of the overall value. And some of that was optional. He didn't have to roll. If it had been at the time, it had been waited until the actual transaction happened, that probably would have been closer to 40 or 50% role.
Yeah. And then final question for you on this kind of idea of like transitioning a management team prior to a sale. Did you work with anybody? Was there a recruiting firm involved, or have you guys considered bringing a recruiting firm to find suitable replacement candidates?
We have done in previous deals. In this one, we were fortunate that it was an industry we knew well, and we had worked with an individual that was looking for a role, and it was our black book, if you like, that we were able to bring to bear with our client, which made it all very seamless. But we have looked at recruitment companies in the past to bring someone on board just to fill in, sometimes not the CEO, but just to make sure we have a complete team before we go to market.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great story and great example of creating value, kind of that pre-market phase. Michael, could you share with us a story again around this pre-market before hiring an investment banker on a deal that you worked on that you've been really able to create and maximize value?
Sure, John. Let me just kind of start out with the takeaways so people know where I'm heading with the story. One, it's very important to be able to convert a lot of weaknesses in your company to opportunities. In order to do that, business owners have to do something they're not comfortable with, which is admit and identify their weaknesses. And that often our recommendation would be to use a third party that's familiar with M&A. Could be an M&A advisor, could be a lawyer, or the like. The story is started with a tour of this food company, and we noticed that a lot of the machinery was down, which just seemed odd. They're impressing us, and it seemed like over half the machines were down. And that led to a discussion on, well, what else? What is that problem is that causing? And that causing a lot of overtime. It caused a lot more inventory that they had to make when they did. Optimization of the warehouse was problematic. And so all of a sudden, this weakness of theirs that they initially resisted, but then readily, I'll just say, embraced because it was so obvious, led to us encouraging a consultant to come in that was a specialist. We did a really nice project and identified several $1 million, and I mean several $1 million of savings. When we got engaged and as the process progressed, they did more and more phases of this study and ended up spending, I'll just say, I think $200,000 or $300,000 on the study, which is a lot. But all of a sudden, the buyers had visibility on the savings of $2.5 million, which was quite a wow. Now, I can't with certainty say that they got their 8 multiple times $2.5 million. However, they got a premium valuation for the company, and so it definitely helped. And so, bottom line, the recommendation is, try to get an assessment as early as possible on what your true weaknesses are. Most importantly, what buyers are going to perceive as your weaknesses.
Yeah, a couple of questions there. Did you have like specific expertise in the food space to identify that machinery was probably not at industry standard levels, or?
We had some experience. I think it would, to a experienced investment banker in M&A, you just saw some things that, sometimes those of us who haven't been through a plant before just don't pick up on. And there were, as I pointed out in the beginning, little things, but they just started adding up. And then you started looking at the numbers and you saw the result of those problems. So, it certainly helps if someone is going to critique your business, to make sure that you're talking to the right person with the right experience.
Mm-hmm. And then in terms of, sometimes I find that you can paint the picture for a buyer, but their, skepticism level is super high. So what was the skepticism around believing the potential cost savings that could have come out of that report? Like, how did you convince the buyer that these cost savings are realizable and could be achieved?
Yeah, it's a great question. We actually had the consulting firm who were very good, very experienced at the manufacturing meetings. Very often, I'll just say, the head of manufacturing would resist that. It shows weakness, and I think it was really kudos to the company that felt comfortable enough to have those people there talking about exactly what they did. And in some cases, it was irrefutable. In other cases, it was debatable. Like I said, no one told us they were adding back $2.5 million, but bottom line, they paid a significant premium for the company.
Mm-hmm. And then final question for you, Michael. So, a $200,000 consulting fee engagement is not a small engagement. How do you convince the client that spending those dollars are going to equate to, that the cost savings times a multiple?
I bring Simon in to convince them. So he's better sales than I am. So I think it starts out small, and we will basically now have a library of these types of situations where we show a consultant, or my second example will be a brand management company, adds significant value. It just so happens in the larger transactions, these types of studies are pretty standard operating procedure. So people don't do it for their health. What they're really doing it is to make sure that the buyer feels a lot more comfortable. In this case, we started out with this relatively modest sized assignment. I think it was 35,000, and it just ended up buyers were very, very intrigued with this and very interested. So
that's great. Awesome story. Okay, let's move on to the next phase that we're going to be talking about. So this is the preparation phase. This is after a business has hired an investment banker or an M&A advisor, but before the LOI. So let's talk about how you guys have been able to create value and really maximize value. So we're entering into kind of the transaction and the marketing phase. Simon, how about you share your story with us? And before you do, let me just quickly remind the audience, please enter your anything in the Q&A box, any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we're going to be addressing those at the last 10 minutes of the discussion here. So Simon, sorry, please.
Sure. No, thanks, John. And just say hi to those ICA members I see on the chat box that are joining and supporting us today, and don't ask too many difficult questions, please. Just in terms of once we've been appointed, and I'll talk through a transaction that we completed actually back in 2001, which was a 90 million sterling deal, but this would be true in the UK, and this is where slight divergence maybe with the US. And Lindley, interested to get your views from Australia. But on any deal in the UK above 30-40 million, we would expect a suite of information to go with the information memorandum when we're selling a business. So on this transaction, we had what's called vendor financial due diligence prepared, which enables the buyer to have advantage of that financial due diligence before they make their best and final bid. We'll also look at legal due diligence and also sometimes commercial due diligence if we're selling to private equity. And in this particular transaction, we knew we'd kind of warmed up the market previously with a number of fireside chats with the management team, meeting private equity firms. And when we went to market, we knew it was going to be a very competitive process. And we wanted to make the most of that momentum. So we created the excitement in the market. We then had all the data and detail to follow the information memorandum that kept the momentum going and meant that we were able to complete in just a few weeks after the best and final offers. And that's because we'd done all the buyer's work for them. The reports were being addressed directly to the buyer, and that meant that they could be satisfied with the quality of due diligence. I guess it gave them a name to go after if it wasn't quite as they'd been told. But we found that by doing that, it kept the momentum, kept the competitive tension really, really strong. And that's a great way when you've got a business that's hot in the market of maintaining that momentum, getting best price.
So just again, it's going to compare notes here globally on kind of that practice, but vendor due diligence, that's over and above just the quality of earnings report then.
Yes, it's a full, it's usually quite a full review of all the financials, both historic and forecast. And it tends to work, we will use it when we're doing trade buyers and a dual track process. but trade probably wouldn't get the benefit of the commercial due diligence, which is more about customer referencing, position in market, because strategic trade buyers would tend to know that already. It's really to help spoon through the private equity investors and make sure they have all the information they need and everyone's on the same playing field, so that we're helping with, I guess, putting everyone in the same place with an understanding of the company's market position, but also their financial standing and forecast position.
And then, I mean, the seller will rep and warranty the due diligence that's done.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. And then, and that's typically prepared by an independent third-party firm outside of the investment bank.
Yes, we wouldn't do that. We bring in, if we're going to go to an international buyer pool, we would tend to use top 6 accounting firms. For the private equity market, we may use top 10. Depending on the size of the transaction. Certainly, you know, if it's larger than 100 million, we would tend to go with the top 6 again. But really, this is a practice that comes from around 30 million and upwards in the UK. It's not obviously mandatory. It's up to, you've got to convince the vendor to underwrite the cost. And sometimes that's not, you know, insignificant, depending on the size of the business. You know, that can run to many hundreds of thousands of pounds if the deal didn't happen. And sometimes, you know, we prepared one pre-COVID, and the vendor did have quite a big bill when his business was fairly consumer focused, and it got impacted significantly through the COVID period.
Do you find that impacts valuation, or is it more kind of speed, certainty of closure? Where do you think it really delivers value?
I think it does a bit of both, because it takes away some of the uncertainty up front when people are bidding. And you know, when people put first bid in, it's kind of difficult to move them upwards from that unless you've got something compelling and new to bring to the table. So if you're able to take away that uncertainty with previous results and have an independent view, then, you know, that helps in terms of that first assessment of value. So I think that's really good.
Yeah, super interesting. Just quickly, Lindley and Michael, I'll start with Lindley. What's your experience in Australia around vendor due diligence?
Yeah, vendor due diligence tends not to be done in the same way, because normally the purchaser wants to do their own due diligence. However, there is adding to Simon's situation, there are times where we may get an independent report to validate something that we think could be an issue, whether that's a review of assets or whether that's a review of a particular aspect of the business.
Awesome. Michael, quickly, what's your experience on vendor due diligence, or is it more around quality of earnings?
Yeah, we have very little experience, just occasionally bring in an expert that issues a report, but nothing that Simon is describing.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. It's always great to kind of compare notes globally on what the trends and practices are. Michael, you're up next in terms of providing a story around kind of this, you know, engaging the investment banker to LOI.
So the story I'll start with was a catalog company. The catalog company had gone to market, and the feedback was the catalog sales were declining and e-commerce was growing. And not surprisingly, the prices were much lower in e-commerce, and their margins, gross margins, were going down. And buyers just had an issue with that. What we did is we looked at it a little more holistically and looked at it not in gross margin terms, which is a number that everyone focuses on, but contribution margin, and basically dug in and netted out all the costs related to the catalog and the minimal costs related to the catalog when you're dealing with e-commerce. And at the end of the day, demonstrated for the buyer that, for the next set of buyers, that this was not a problem. If anything, it was a good thing. And we were really more focused on net contribution margin. What tends to happen in our industry is people just default to certain numbers, and that gross margin is one of them. Overall, the takeaway here is, understand what you're basically trying to do is, as Simon alluded to, is minimize the risk, the perceived risk. There was a perception of tremendous risk that just didn't exist. And so we dug in. The second part of that story is people was really understanding, the takeaway is understanding what the buyer's needs are. And the catalog company that we ultimately sold to, their name started with, I'll give a hint, started with the word discount. And so that was their position. That was that was where they were heading. We were, if we had to, have a name, would be Mercedes or Cadillac. And so we demonstrated our market position by, again, conducting a brand study done by a brand management company that was very, very good at it, and showed our perception of our brand was very, very high. And in the course of doing that, all of a sudden, you saw the buyer developing a whole new strategy around this. Now, you could say, well, how could that happen in the Amazon world? And what we did is we focused on new product innovation and introduced 500 new products every year, something Amazon couldn't do. So in understanding, going down a little deeper, understanding the buyer's needs and fears, you can help position the company. And in the course of helping better understand the brand, we also teased out the secret sauce of our business versus their business that was many, many times our size. So the transaction actually happened, and it happened at about 8 or 9% higher than the prior transactions, LOI, that fell apart.
Okay, interesting. And I mean, that's kind of similar to Lindley's story, where she was trying to strategically position the business even before going to market. But it sounded like you specifically positioned it depending on the buyer and where they were coming from. So a little bit, same strategy, just a different timing through the M&A process.
Yeah, I mean, the insight is, people say, what's my company worth? And very often we'll say, well, it depends on who the buyer is. And so, and so I think it's very important, and it's not intuitive to a lot of people representing sellers or sellers, that you really do need to understand who the buyer is, because values vary tremendously depending on the buyer's needs.
Will you tailor, confidential information memorandum specifically for a buyer, or will it be kind of generic, and then once you get into kind of conversations, then you'll do the positioning?
We have, usually we have one SIM. However, very often there's two acquisition rationales, and we'll have two SIMs. And then we just may have two SIMs, and then one specifically for one particular buyer that we know very well, or that knows the company very well. Mm-hmm. So, but for the most part, one is typical, two is an exception, but we don't have a problem doing that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. And just a reminder to our audience, if you could put the Q&A, your questions in the Q&A box versus the chat box, that would help me out at the end so I can just sort through them. Lindley, if you could provide us with your story. We haven't talked to you for a while here, so glad to get you back in the conversation.
I'm still awake.
Yeah, great.
Very pleased to know. I'm going to actually sort of just talk in a few general terms and link with what both Michael and Simon have said. So I think it's really important when you have an advisor that if you're a vendor, that you use them and use all of their experience and get them to really input into it, particularly in this phase, because that's where a lot of value can be created. And picking up with what both Simon and Michael have said about anticipating what the buyer wants. And one of the things that is challenging, and one of the reasons why ACRE, we have our partnership, is we do a lot of cross-border transactions. And cross-border transactions bring another level of nuance, because what you're doing is you're actually dealing with not only the client and what the client in your jurisdiction has, but you actually have to anticipate what the buyers in another jurisdiction want. And what that means is you have to adjust the information you present and think about it in terms of how that information translates. And so for us, I'll give you an example. We have done a number of transactions in Japan. And in Australia, we have a tax regime that looks at assets and you get a tax benefit if you write off your assets and depreciate them very, very quickly. In Japan, they don't have that same tax treatment. So when a Japanese buyer looks at a balance sheet of an Australian company, it looks like there's hardly any assets. So what that then does, it means that we have to provide in our information memorandum a list of assets with a valuation so that the actual buyer knows that there are working assets with longer life than what the balance sheet may look like. It is also important, we deal with a lot of family businesses, and when a family business sells, it has, the way it's run its business is very different to what a multinational may need. And we've had to spend quite a bit of time often convincing family businesses that the level of detail and information that a multinational may require is different to how the information that they may require and they've been using. So this using your advisor is really important, and also being guided by what is it that the actual counterparty would need to know that would make your business be most attractive, and presenting it, and also having the information and data sets and due diligence files that actually support what the narrative is and what the business is that you're selling.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example with the cross-border transaction. So would you seek advisors to kind of provide guidance in the country of the acquirer or in the country of the seller?
This is where ACRE is a great organization, and why we're all part of it, because we're working with our sellers, and then we can reach out to our peers in our network and ask them, how does this happen in your country? What should we do? And they help position and work with you on transactions in a collaborative manner.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, let's move on to the last section of our deal stories. And this is from the point of LOI to closing. So how we're creating and maximizing value in that last phase again of receiving that LOI to actually closing a transaction. So Michael, if you could share with us your M&A deal story on this phase.
So unfortunately, I've got a lot of stories similar to the story I'm about to tell. But I would first start out saying all LOIs are not created equal. And so where companies, and this is happening more and more frequently as buyers get more aggressive and reach out, we're often brought a situation where a seller tells us they have an LOI from a buyer. They are very happy with one another, happy with the price, and they'd like to move forward and just have us help to get it over the goal line. And we explain to them that this is fraught with danger. This is highly problematic, and they generally don't believe it until they start it. So a lot of our transactions, we do play that role. And remarkably, they think the transaction is going to take 2 or 3 months, and it's still almost all those take 6 months because they weren't prepared. And so, so there's, I think, 6 key kind of problems associated with this. Number one, there's a high risk that the deal gets repriced after the buyer does real due diligence, something that the investment banker would have done and sometimes take 2, 3, 4 months to prepare the company. So it's not the price that they have in the LOI is very, I'll use a technical term, mushy. Okay. Number two,
that is a very technical term, Michael.
Yes, yeah. Right. And number two, you lose control of the timing. The buyer basically controls the transaction at that point in time, and you go as fast as they'll go. And in some countries, they go very, very slow. Or so you've lost control of the timing, and timing that usually doesn't work for the seller's benefit. The buyer's process is usually far more complex, number three, than the seller is led to believe. And so all of a sudden, the friendly person across this way is introducing you to their consultants, to their accountants, to their board, their financing, their lenders, and it's a lot more complicated than you initially led to believe. 4, the buyer decides to either pass or delay. Just after a couple of months, they just pass. Something came up, that they didn't know about. And then number 5, I'm losing track. Once that happens, you are starting all over again. If there's a process, you can always go back to number 2 or 3 bidder. Here, you just may have spent 3, 4, 5 months with somebody, find out the transaction is what you thought, and you're literally starting from day one. And then lastly, and I find this an important one, is when we run an auction and we show people 5 offers, there's a lot of qualitative judgment that goes in. And at least, probably almost half the time, we're not going necessarily with the highest bidder because of those qualitative issues. And so there's no means of comparison. It may seem like a wonderful transaction, but seller really doesn't know. So in general, the war story that I just told, it just seems to happen more and more lately. And it's just the process is hard. I'm sure all of us in this Zoom call would admit that it's not easy. We tell people you're not going to want to do this again. So do it right the first time. And so our recommendation is follow a process. And every investment banker has their process, but follow a process versus looking at the first LOI that comes your way and thinking it's a great deal.
Yeah, and I've often heard that you really start to lose control once you given up exclusivity, right? So is it just extending and negotiating as far as you can with all the parties to a point that you've reduced as much certainty, or you've created as much certainty on the party and the closing as possible? Is that kind of how you mitigate that?
I think when you're talking about full disclosure, and when you have your group of finalists, very often sellers don't want to tell them that bad news until the very end. And we try to have full disclosure on all the good, the bad, and the ugly, and make sure that if you have 3 or 4 final bidders, they all absorb all that information up front.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's awesome. And you're right. I mean, it is a theme that keeps on coming up time and time again. So it could be applied to almost every story, every M&A transaction.
Yep.
Lindley, if you could share with us your story on after receiving an LOI to closing, how you've been able to maximize value for clients.
Okay, so I'm really from adding on to what Michael said, and there's patterns of stories that are the same, and getting a letter of intent is great. A lot of clients think that's great, I'm nearly there. Sometimes it's 90% of the effort to get to a letter of intent, and then 90% effort to complete a deal. And sometimes just getting to the letter of intent to completion is a very, very complex process, particularly when there is economic uncertainty and there's volatility in markets like there is at the moment. Like Michael, it's really, we try to get a clear outline of the steps to close. We also like to understand where there is conflicts, because sometimes you'll find that particular parties are exiting in the vendor, other parties are staying, and sometimes there is conflicts, like one group may prefer one party over another, or maybe really advocating for something that may not be in the best interests of the whole. And the biggest thing that I find is to make sure you can still do this very detailed work and analysis and work with your advisor, but you've got to keep the business running. That is and keep your eye on your business, because if something happens and that transaction doesn't complete or it takes longer, you still need to be able to present a business that is performing well and highly functioning. So it's a very complex and delicate time in my view.
Yeah, I always find that the forecast that we provide kind of early on, the months pass and actual results are compared to the forecast. And that can often derail a transaction if a company is missing their forecasts as the transaction gets nearer to completion. So have you seen that before, Lindley?
Yeah, a lot. So what we normally do when we're working with a client is get them to have their deal team, and then have the business team that are running the business. And the more that we can, that I've said this to vendors, the more that your business is improving its performance as we do the transaction, the more likely we can put pressure on for a better price.
So just clarification on that. You actually get your client to kind of have a number of people that are specifically handling the transaction and the deal, and everyone else is just running the business.
Yeah. And of course, the poor CEO has to do a bit of both. But what we, we really say we've got to have someone running the business and someone running the transaction, because otherwise it just value can dissipate.
Yeah. Who would that typically be? Would that be like maybe a CFO, or would that be somebody in kind of corporate operational side? The
chief operating officer or CFO or combination runs the business while their CEO is doing the deal.
Yeah, such an important point, because I mean, these transactions are time consuming, and you definitely don't want the business to have any hiccups from the time of LOI to closing, because that can definitely cause retrading or coming back with a different price or terms. Simon, if you could share with us the last story of the day around, again, LOI to closing and how you've helped your clients maximize value.
Yeah, I think it comes back to what we've been talking about earlier. The more preparation you do, the less time you need to be between LOI and completion. So it's how you said, John, it's about keeping control of that process and giving the buyer less time or less reasons to be able to chip the deal, reduce the price. So I think if you go through the vendor DD exercise, you can run that LOI period to completion in about 2 weeks sometimes, and that gives very little time. But coming back to what Michael said in terms of where we are working on something at the moment where the clients come to us, what we call a hand-holding role. They've had an offer, they're happy with the offer, they're happy with the buyer, and they want us to help them transact it and get it across the line. Now, to use a kind of soccer analogy, we call that a penalty box transaction. You don't have all the build-up, you just have to put the ball down and put it away, and the deal gets done. Now that sounds easy, but actually, because you haven't done the preparation, you're actually going into the transaction, you haven't done a review of the financials, you haven't done a look at the strategic plan of the business going forward post-acquisition, and you haven't done a review of all your information and records in terms of the due diligence process. So what started off as a penalty transaction, penalty box deal, is actually not, because you just haven't done that preparation. And you put control in the hands of the buyer to start due diligence and to therefore look for reasons to maybe change the deal. And all you're left with at that point, instead of a plan B, well, we've got someone who's only a few weeks behind you that we can go to, and we know what they offered, and they've done all their DD. You haven't got that plan B. All you've got is to say, well, the vendor doesn't have to sell, and he can retain the business and go back out to full market. And we do use that as a way of keeping buyers on track from time to time.
I love, we all talk about creating a competitive auction when going to market in maximizing value, but I love getting into the specifics. So how much more value can you, just to give our audience kind of a real appreciation for how important this is, but how much more value have you seen from kind of like initial LOI to running a really competitive process to kind of final, in terms of like increased percentages? And I'll ask all our panelists this question. But Simon, I'll ask you that. What have you seen from kind of initial LOI to increase?
We actually, if we run a process, the deals that we've been able to convince a vendor not just to accept the first offer that comes along, but to either go into a mini process with 3 or 4 others, or to go into a wider full marketing process. We did some research, and we think it probably increases the price on average by about 40%. So
40%,
we had one
wow.
party that was offered 18 million, 18 million. We persuaded the vendor. He was happy with that. He said, "That's all I need for my life. Let's just get the deal done." And we persuaded him to go out to market. That party didn't increase their bid, but we sold the business for 48 million to another party, and it took longer. But the vendor was very, very happy that he helped us set up our next business because he was so pleased with what we'd done there.
Yeah, I feel those specifics really provide the our audience and just the general public with the importance of running a process and the importance of not only running a process but having the right advisors run that process. So I appreciate you sharing those details. Michael, give us an example of kind of the true value creation. This is where I think this is a really important panel discussion that we're having. But give us an example of the value creation that you brought for some clients by just running a real dedicated, tight, disciplined process.
So this topic is near and dear to my heart. I been in the industry 30 years. I had heard investment bankers always say, and we add a lot of value. And in general, I'll just say anecdotally, it can be anywhere from 10 to, if I look at the highest range, 80%. And two things happened that I just want to shout out. Number one is I looked at to see if there's any study about this, anything around that really proved that. We all knew it anecdotally. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, we commissioned a study by a Fairfield University professor. And I believe it's on our website, portermorse.com. And it's the first study ever done that literally didn't interview investment bankers, but interviewed people who sold their business between 10 and 250 million. And it was extremely hard to those folks to sign, to fill out, I'll just say market research studies. But we hired a market research firm, and at the end of the day, the study is, I think, the only one of its kind. So I would encourage people to download the white paper. We have it's a pretty dense 25-pager. We have, I think, a summary of it, about 4 pages that does it. But at the end of the day, the investment bankers, they're almost across the board. These group of people that had no reason to give anyone a better mark or a good mark, it was all confidential, stated where the investment banker added value. And it was very, very interesting to hear that, where they did. We actually, at our board meeting about 5 years ago, was asked that question. We said, we're not sure exactly. And so started tracking these. And in the last 15, maybe 18 transactions now, almost every single one except one, we increased the value anywhere from 5% to 80%. And the key there, and I'll tweak your question, it wasn't from LOI stage, it was from the beginning stage, where they either had an LOI and then decided to hire an investment bank, or they interviewed 3 or 4 investment banks. We took the midpoint. And so there was a legitimate, bona fide market value. And what was amazing is it just keeps happening transaction to transaction. And it's, I think, not unique necessarily to us, but unique to anybody who's qualified to represent these middle market companies. And so first place to go would be ACA. We've just got an extraordinary group of 41 investment banks all around the world. And it's exciting to be part of this industry where you are adding so much value.
Yeah, and the thing I love about the competitive process is it's documented, right? Like you have that first initial LOI, and then you could see the red line changes from initial LOI to what you actually achieve at closing. So again, that's why I love doing these conversations with professionals like the group we have today. But also it is real value creation. Lindley, if you can give us a quick example of how much you've been able to achieve for your clients. Quantitatively from kind of running a competitive process or just running a really disciplined M&A process?
It's really been in most of our transactions anywhere from 10 to 50% increase in value. One of the things that I find really interesting is a lot of clients say to me, I wish that I understood what my business really was at the beginning of the process and when I was running the business, not at the end, because this process makes you think about what are the value drivers and where you could increase value. And they have often lamented if they understood that more when they were running the business, they could have created a bigger business. But it's the actual pulling apart all the value from, starting with the narrative through to a competitive tension and closing a deal. But also the other thing that I think that a network like Acre brings is we bring parties that you wouldn't normally expect to bring, particularly in mid-market. Because of all of our partners, we're able to bring some really interesting counterparties that as an advisor on your own, you would not be able to bring to the table.
Yeah, I think the interesting point you said, like, going through the M&A process, I think it illustrates, where the business owner could have increased value or where they could have made their business better. But it also gives them the buyer's perspective, which, a business owner will never get unless they run through a process on, not only, what they see valuable, but where they see risks. So it's, I find it very eye-opening for sellers when they go through the process, just to see how other people view their business and maybe where some of the strengths, but also weaknesses might be.
Yeah.
Awesome. Let's jump into some questions here. We have quite a few. So first question for Simon here. So how do you pick the right accounting firm to match the company you're working with? So how do you know it's the right fit when you're bringing in, and I guess I can ask everybody, but when you're bringing in outside advisors, how do you find the right kind of outside advisor to help?
Yeah, so for us, we're working in the southern part of the UK, across London as well. So we tend to know the transaction services professionals, people who are doing the financial due diligence. We tend to know those that are in our area. And obviously, we're talking maybe about the top 10 accounting firms. We may go, depending on different deals, beyond that, but we tend to know those teams. And it depends on the size of the transaction, the size of our client's wallet, and how, prepared they are to spend the money. Obviously, the bigger firms will tend to cost more. But we're also interested in sector experience. Because there's certain nuances in the way different firms will account for certain aspects of their business. And we want to understand the information that someone can bring to the party. So we'll do a beauty parade of maybe 2 or 3 parties with a vendor, and then we'll choose on a combination of price and previous experience in the sector.
Lindley and Michael, is that kind of a fair process that you guys would run as well?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this is a great question. I mean, we've talked about a lot of success stories, but maybe can we talk about where M&A transactions didn't go as planned, and maybe some quick lessons learned. Lindley, I'll start with you.
Okay. So we did have one client that we haven't sold the business because we've asked them to go and we stopped the process because they needed to get their management information sort of structures in a better position than what they had. They didn't understand that they needed to be able to give very, very detailed information, and their accounting system wasn't up for it because they'd grown their business quite rapidly but didn't have the right accounting system. So stop the process. They're doing that, and then we will bring that business back to the market next year.
And what would you do differently in that situation?
Insist that they do that before. They were very insistent. They still wanted to go forward. But if they as we went forward, we realized they weren't going to get the price that they wanted. So if they wanted the price they wanted, they actually had to go, which is a fulsome price. They had to go and get their information system in better order.
Yeah. Michael, can you share a situation where maybe an M&A transaction didn't go as planned?
Well, it's going back to the example I used. We had a client who 3 times failed doing a transaction on his own, wanted us to help him, and finally he gave up and he hired us, but he told us he wanted to sell to this one firm. And we told him that was a big mistake. We just repeating ourselves many times over. He basically convinced us that they're the firm. And in the I mentioned the last 18 transactions, 17 went up after we got hired. This one went down, and it was very, very frustrating for him because you just kind of forget what happens. You just know that you've hired an investment banker and the price is going down. And it had, and by the way, it took 6 months when it was supposed to take 2 months to close. And so, you know, the takeaway there is nothing like being prepared in a situation like that. You know, we learned a lesson that we just sometimes have to put our foot down and not get into the arena because we know we're just going to have a disappointed client at the end of the day.
Okay, Simon, I'll give you the last word on this, and then if you could provide kind of a failed transaction and a lesson learned.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it can come out of the blue. You know, we've had a couple of transactions over the last couple of years where the government has announced a review of the sector, and you know, some of those transactions are live, so I won't mention the sectors, but when you've got the government coming in saying they're going to review charging or certain other aspects, it does make buyers uncertain. And we saw that in the UK with change of prime minister coming in and changing, making announcements about spending, which really put interest rates up from 0.5% to currently closer to 5 or 6%, and that's just created issues with buyers in terms of the cost of capital that they're now borrowing, which meant that transactions just didn't complete. So we've worked quite hard to bring businesses back to market post situations like that. We'll work through the issues because it's all about uncertainty in the buyer's mind. Until that review's over, they're not prepared to pay the full optimum price that we want for the business.
Yeah, I mean, doing these things, a lot of things are out of our control too. I mean, there's lots that we can control, and we talked about that today, but some things are just out of our hands. Hey, I really appreciate your guys' time. And we're at all different hours of the day here on this webinar, and I appreciate your time. I think this was an amazing discussion and conversation. Just again, for the ICA website, it's aicanetwork.com. Is that right, Simon, Michael, and Lindley? Yeah. So if you want to learn more, please go to that. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Do appreciate your time, and all the best.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Thanks, team.
Thank
you, John.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.